Surya Das.
Mega Lama.
Hey.
How you doing, buddy?
Hey.
Working hard out there?
Not too hard.
Liberating countless sentient beings?
Self-liberation.
Starts at home.
Lazy man's Bodhisattva way.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about is how you got interested in this in the first place. Just sort of kind of go over it because it's a great story. And then also continue to reflect on just the state of spirituality in general, Buddhism in particular, but it really, anything that applies to Buddhism applies to virtually any authentic spiritual orientation. And so you were 4 years old when you started meditating.
No, I was 4 years old when I started playing baseball.
So how did you get out of that vocation?
I never got out of that.
You still play it?
When I can, not enough.
So when did you actually get wind? Because people tend to forget, when you and I were going through high school, in this country there were basically no meditation centers. There wasn't even, in 1967 when I graduated, people hardly even heard of TM. I mean, the Beatles were poking their head around and heading over to India to meet the Maharishi. There were no Zen centers.
I never saw anything like that.
So when did
Nothing going on in the synagogue or anything that was of interest in that way.
When did you get wind of any of this?
The first time I knew about Buddhism was when I saw on TV that monk immolating himself on the corner in Saigon.
Yep.
To bring the world's attention to the war in Vietnam.
Right.
That was a rather striking image. Of course, it made no sense to me, but it did pique my curiosity how anybody could do that and why they would do that. And, I started to ask a few questions or read a little, but there wasn't that much really accessible or interesting, for a 16-year-old to read at that time.
What year was that when you were 16?
The middle to late 60s.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about that image, of course, was that it's not that somebody just set themselves on fire. It's somebody got in a lotus position, set themselves on fire, and didn't move.
Yeah, and meditated while doing kind of a symbol of protest, but also of transcendence or of sacrifice or of giving yourself up for the greater good. It was pretty startling and made me think about those things for the first time, questions that had never come up, in Hebrew school or in high school in poli-sci class.
Yeah.
So I started to think about the East a little bit differently rather than just the pictures I had in my mind of masses bathing in the Ganges or something like that.
And between starving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I started to read more widely, and of course you mentioned the Beatles, the Beatles and folk music and Allen Ginsberg and whoever started to talk about those things.
Right. Did you read Alan Watts?
Yeah, Alan Watts, of course, and
Krishnamurti.
Krishnamurti, R.D. Laing, Ram Dass, Aldous Huxley, all of that, Herman Hesse, and so on, formative reading and thinking and kind of campus consciousness at that time, Fritz Perls, encounter groups. I went to Esalen and went to some encounter groups there and then at college on weekends.
Where were you at college?
I was at State University of New York at Buffalo.
Yeah.
And that's where I first really practiced Buddhism and yoga. I went to a weekend with Kapleau Roshi in '68 when I was a freshman.
Philip Kapleau
Roshi, the founder of the Rochester Zen Center. He was probably the first American Zen master.
Well, I think what Philip Kapleau did was a monumental service to Buddhism in general, but spirituality in particular in this country, because as you know, up to that time, as great as Alan Watts was in terms of interpreter and explanation and all of that, he really had a kind of talking Zen approach.
Right.
He was a little bit too influenced by Krishnamurti in a sense. We're already enlightened, which is in the deepest sense is certainly true, but therefore any sort of path or any sort of effort is merely taking you away from the enlightened state. That's a very, very high realization that comes frankly only after years of practice, as you know, even though it's essentially true now and in every moment. But in order to realize that, it's not something you can do just falling off a log, so to speak.
Well, I think he had the disease of shunyata, too much emptiness, and not enough methods. Kapleau was a Zen master, and I was very impressed by his personal presence.
Well, the great thing that Kapleau did, the book, The Three Pillars of Zen, changed everything. First of all, he took Alan Watts to task for just what we're talking about. And he said, look, Zen is first and foremost, it's a practice. So the three pillars of Zen were basically that. It was practice, it was realization, it was training. And that changed everything when that book came out. And certainly for me, when I read that book, I went, okay, I can't just sit around thinking this stuff anymore.
Right. Well, that's what drove me to a Zen weekend My roommate David Schneider and I hitchhiked from Buffalo to Rochester, and we got arrested by the cops on the way on the New Thruway. Typical, 60s stories. Getting busted on the way to meditate.
Right.
Small vehicle, the paddy wagon.
Exactly.
But it wasn't much of a bust after all, But so we went to this weekend, and that kind of changed my thinking about things because of the emphasis on practice, on silence, on the concentration and the mind, and looking into the mind with Zen meditation, and also on enlightenment. But remember, Three Pillars of Zen has a great section in there about enlightenment experience.
Absolutely.
It was the first time I really read, like from a Zen master's point of view, not just some funny stories, but, more like about the psychology and the experience of enlightenment the students in modern times were having.
Exactly. And there were accounts
students in modern times like me could have these.
And there were accounts of the students themselves, 8 or 9 of them, who had had profound satoris, realizations. Yeah.
So I started to want that too, and not just to get high, but to be free.
Yeah.
And I think a real whiff of freedom there. And then Kapleau's personal presence was very impressive, and the Zendo and all was quite different than what I was used to. So that was different enough to really pique my interest. And after that, I started to try to meditate more and find a practice I could do, which, of course, in the dormitories of college life was hard to do. But I sort of carried that theme with me for the next few years, and then that, I think, drove me at the end of college. Rather than going to grad school, I went to India to plumb the root.
Incidentally, by the way, my first sitting with a Zen teacher was with Philip Kapleau as well, and the way it happened in my case was very good friends of mine in Lincoln, Nebraska would vacation once a year in a place in Mexico called Spa Rio Caliente. And it just turned out that that was where Philip Kapleau vacationed each year. So I went with them on vacation intentionally to meet Kapleau and introduce myself to him, and he was wonderful. I was 23 at the time. I was writing Spectrum of Consciousness, and he had 2 or 3 of his students, and so he invited me to sit in with their meditations, and it had the same kind of impact on me. He's a wonderful person. But why didn't you end up just studying at Rochester with him?
Well, it was totally clear that I wasn't ready. I mean, I met him when I was 17 years old. I went back to college, and I was getting stoned. I never even went to Rochester to see him again.
Because it just wasn't, your time wasn't ripe.
Yeah, my time wasn't ripe, and I was busy. I went to Washington to march in demonstrations, and I went to California for Esalen workshops, counter groups, and went to Woodstock Festival.
So you were actually...
Experimental time.
You were at 3 days of peace, love, and music?
Mm-hmm.
Did your smiling face make it into the film?
No, I never saw it, but I saw a lot of other smiling faces that looked just like mine, including the mud and the long hair and the running after the helicopters, dropping the sandwiches when there was no more food. And my car was mired to the hubcaps in mud. It took us till Monday night or afternoon to get it out.
And so then off to India, though, at some point.
Yeah, well, then in May of 1970, my friend was shot and killed at Kent State, in Krause. So that kind of turned my head around about fighting for peace and protesting and radical politics. And I started to think, it was kind of a shock to me. It had felt very romantic and exciting, the late 60s, almost like we were sort of narcissistic. Like, yes, we feel like we're changing the world, but also like we're in a movie. It was all very exciting and unreal. And suddenly it became a lot more real, dangerous, like life and death intruded. You mean like, we might not grow up. Somebody could be dead. An artist, not even a soldier who's gone off to fight a war. Like, you could be killed on campus. And I thought, I could die too. I started to think about things, face mortality and impermanence and eternity a little differently.
Sure.
And anyway, I graduated in May of 71, and by the end of May, I was hitchhiking across Europe, in Greece, going the overland route across Turkey, Tehran.
You'd have a little harder time getting across that today, wouldn't you?
Yes, it's different.
Yeah.
It was nice then, and I climbed up inside the twin Buddhas at Bamiyan and ended up in India in about August of 71 at my first Vipassana meditation course with Goenka. That was the beginning of my daily meditation practice, which I don't know how, it's amazing, but I would say I've been meditating every day since then, since August of 71.
Yeah.
And so I always consider Goenka my first meditation teacher. Right. He really got me meditating. Kapleau Roshi introduced me, but I didn't keep meditating from that.
Yeah.
Goenka, I went to many Goenka courses.
He's a wonderful teacher.
He is wonderful. He's a little puritanical, but besides that, he's certainly wonderful.
I understand. Well, it's a puritanical streak in Theravada.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then you decided, though, that you wanted to deepen your understanding, your realization, so you basically kept pursuing Buddhism in some of its other paths.
Yeah, well, Buddhism, I wasn't really just fixed on Buddhism, but I was looking for God or truth or peace or wisdom or something.
It's just consciousness training, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was the early 70s, and again, I was young. I hit India, I was still 20.
Yeah.
And I went to Nukaroli Baba, and he gave me my name, and he was my first guru. He died in 73, and then I went to Lama Yeshe in Zopin, Kathmandu, Nepal, and stayed at their monastery, and met the Dalai Lama in 71 and 72. And then when Maharaji died in 73, I started to stay full-time with my Tibetan teachers, Kala Rinpoche, Karmapa's monasteries in Darjeeling and Sikkim. So I never really decided, but it just sort of went in that direction. Then in 74, I needed money, so I went to Japan. So I keep studying Buddhism, in this case Zen, but also work and make some money.
And why Japan?
Kyoto, and studied Zen in Japan with Uchiyama Roshi.
Why was it easier to make money in Japan than in India?
Well, you can't make money in India.
But you don't need money in India.
Right. Well, if you stay there after a few years, you might.
Okay.
To get visas or medicine or...
I see.
Minimum money. Like I said, I was in the 2,000 a year, but I was there year after year. I sold my pen. I sold my dungaree jacket, Freak Street in Kathmandu, $5 or $10 worth of a jacket.
Keep you going for a month or two. Yeah. So you ended up in Kyoto.
So I went to Kyoto, lived near a Daitokuji monastery in Kyoto, and studied Zen with Uchiyama Roshi at Antaiji, where quite a few Westerners studied.
Yeah.
And then I went back to be with Kala Rinpoche in Darjeeling in 75.
So you had a few dollars in your pocket, enough to keep you going for
another few years in India.
And so you were back and studying with Kala again. Mm-hmm. And is that when you went into your first retreat?
No. He went to Europe to start the first 3-year retreat for Westerners. Then he and Karmapa asked me and a few other people like me to help translate and bring some lamas to their centers in the West. So I went and did that and started the KTD monastery in Woodstock in 77, 78. And then in 80, I went to France to join the next round of 3-year retreat.
And so that was your first extended.
80.
Yeah. And how did you feel your practice was going at that time? Did you feel it was adequate, that you were really understanding it was moving forward, there were still yearnings that weren't being answered? What was your sort of general state as you were going?
All of that, Ken. I was still young and exploring, and the languages were hard, and the concepts, and I studied Tibetan, but it was hard to understand Sanskrit or Hinduism and English. So, and yoga and these things were just being explained, and good translators and Western teachers that could bridge the gap were just emerging. So I felt good. I mean, I was really into it, but there were definitely questions and doubts and so on. But I completed my Nundro there in Woodstock in 77, and I was deep into Tibetan Buddhist practice. No doubt about that. I mean, hundreds of thousands of practices and all. But I would say that I had a glimpse of what I called God in the late 60s, but I didn't really get what I'd call introduction to the nature of the mind until I was in my 3-year retreat.
Yeah. And
that was in the early 80s. So in the 70s, I was practicing, but it was kind of like I was practicing without clarity about the goal.
Sure. But you were still, obviously, there was a very deep drive in the best sense and a deep doubt in the best sense. As you know, Zen uses the word doubt. Right. In the sense it means great doubt, means great faith, actually. Yeah. And so you were obviously driven by that great faith. I mean, look at the trek. Look at your journey. It's really extraordinary.
I was full-time living in the monasteries, and, if I was working, it wasn't, I wasn't really a householder. But it was really only in the 80s when I was in a 3-year retreat and became a monk that I really got some traction, I would say, on the path, and realized that my guru's mind, heart, mind, and mind were not different.
Right.
And with that glimpse of the goal or of the reality underlying everything,
the ground,
then the path was greatly enhanced. All the relative practices are greatly enhanced by that kind of view, with, let's say, recognition or even realization.
Right.
And those are big words, but it's not so far from us, so I don't hesitate to use them at this point.
One of the things that's so extraordinary, as you know, is it's the utter simplicity of the ever-present that makes Satori or Kensho or a glimpse into the nature of mind seem difficult, because it literally is the nature of this in every moment. And that realization is, in a sense, it's the goal, but it's also the ground. But it's one of the great things in, I think, the Buddhist tradition that tends to be forgotten, or at least not put front and center in some of the other spiritual traditions, and that's the very fundamental importance of an actual enlightenment or realization or awakening to this timeless, spaceless, ever-present state that is your own true condition. And that's one of the things I think that when you get that glimpse, and this was certainly a profound glimpse was happening in your first retreat, that's when all the fundamental questions become resolved in a certain sense.
Yeah, well, many think that an enlightenment experience is the end of the path, but it's often been called the beginning of the true path. And that was certainly my case. After that, practice had a different meaning. It's kind of like you're playing the piano. You're not just practicing, so one day you'll play it. Practice is the reality. It's not just practicing for the real thing.
No, I understand.
You know you are in the game. It is the game.
Right.
You know that there's a there, and it's here. And so all of one's efforts are meaningful, but there's not this looking forward, leaning forward always. That really changes everything. And that's why I feel that the non-dual practices like Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Vedanta, and so on really have a lot to say to us today.
I agree. So, the non-dual traditions themselves talk about two truths. And ultimately, the two truths are not two.
Not two.
But the two truths, to sort of get the conversation started, is the ultimate non-dual absolute radical truth, which is ever-present, timeless, isness, suchness, moment to moment, fully present. 100% of it is fully present right now. And then in the relative world, there's all the things you can do in the finite realm, including working on your personality or working on your diet or lifting weights or all the things in the relative world that you can do to become a better vehicle. Mm-hmm. And the best of the traditions pay a great deal of attention to doing both of those. And so you can do all the relative practices. You can even do psychotherapy. You can do any number of things to improve that relative vehicle. But without that realization of ever-present suchness or ground, then you really are kind of just spinning your wheels and playing in shadows. And so I think that's one of the great things that these paths in particular bring to this whole area.
Well, Dzogchen Master Jigme Lingpa said that until you have that glimpse of recognition, it's just like throwing rocks in the dark. You don't know where the target is or if there's a target. But after you've had a glimpse, then everything's different. You have a different orientation. It's like knowing where the pole star is, even when you can't see it.
Suzuki Roshi had a wonderful way of putting all that, as you know, in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is one of the wonderful statements of ever-present awareness.
A real classic.
It's a classic, and it was that we meditate to express our Buddhahood, not to attain it. Right. And that's a classic post-enlightenment.
Perspective, isn't it, coming from Buddha nature rather than heading towards the other shore?
Exactly. Now, when you were in that retreat, the kinds of practices on a typical 3-year retreat include a full spectrum, leading all the way up to Ultimate Mahamudra and Dzogchen Aki. When did you sort of fall into the rhythm of 3 years? There you were, day in, day out, doing that kind of retreat.
Well, at first, entering it, I felt like I was leaving everything behind. It was like dying. I had to go there, and I didn't really see that there would be an end to it. Yeah. Of course, like everything else, 3 years passes, and then you're back, pedestrian pounding the streets again. But the first year it seemed to take a while. The second year went fast, and the third year was like a blink. Yeah. But I do remember that when I had my breakthrough or introduction to the nature of mind, then after that, time had a different meaning. Yeah. And it sort of turned me around, and I was more attuned to the ground rather than the figures. Yeah. The figure ground shift it changed everything, and then the relationship is much more rich. So in our retreat, it was more of a Dzogchen retreat anyway, so Dudjom Rinpoche and Khyentse Rinpoche taught us what they call the Dzogchen view of Nundra, the Dzogchen view of deity yoga, the Dzogchen view of tantric yoga, and so on. So there was that influence from the beginning, not just waiting for the third year or fourth year to get to the non-dual perspective and the view and all that.
That's the way Chagu Tolku would teach as well, and so that's the introduction I had also. So you came out of the 3-year retreat. Well, at least it wasn't like our mutual friend Ken MacLeod. He went to his first 3-year retreat, came out, called Rinpoche, said, "You did it wrong, do it again." So he went back and did another 3-year retreat.
Well, Ken has his own karma, but...
So you came out of that. Was that when you felt that you yourself really wanted to be a Lama and dedicate your life to that?
No, not at all. I didn't think like that. I was in retreat. I was in France. My teachers were there. It was wonderful, and I wanted more of that. I wanted to do more practice. So we built another retreat center, and 13 of us did another one. So I stayed there for 8 years. Yeah. I was thinking about practicing, and and loved what I was doing, and I didn't know if I'd ever come back to America. You know, it was my life, that's all.
So you came out of that retreat, and at some point there must have been a transition into a realization that you really needed yourself to pass on this understanding, that that's part of the bargain, basically.
Well, we started a third 3-year retreat, but then Dudjom Rinpoche died there next door in his house, and so we got involved for 1 year with prayers and preserving his body, and,
sure.
And then we took his body to Nepal and carried it, went on the plane, you know, and interred it in a stupa in Nepal. So that was kind of the end of that third 3-year retreat after 1 year.
Yeah. Well, it's, in a certain way, though, it's a rather extraordinary way to end something like that, isn't it?
Well, that was the transition. Then I got invited to teach in Vipassana centers in Switzerland, in England, and in America, so I started doing that. Then Khyentse Rinpoche died. Then I went with Nyoshi Khenpo. We went to Bhutan together for the funeral. So I was kind of bouncing back and forth and doing a little teaching. You know, it just sort of happened organically that way.
Right. And do you think the Tibetans had any idea that this wild American was going to start teaching Dzogchen?
No idea.
Oh, man, how...
I don't think the Tibetans think much about what the Westerners are doing. You know, it's a different relation. Like, the Tibetans are thinking about Tibet and what the Tibetans are going to do.
Yeah.
And the Westerners are there to help.
I understand.
To support and politically or financially, or to build, or to translate, or to organize. That's what the Westerners are good for generally.
It's one of the very, very great difficulties is that no matter how exalted a particular religion or spirituality might be, and this really applies to every spirituality that I'm aware of, it still generally comes out of a tradition. That tradition has its own kind of ethnocentric orientation, its own roots. It doesn't matter how transcendental you are, you can't jump out of your skin.
And traditions culturally.
Exactly.
Like when I was in Japan, Japanese would say, Americans could never really practice Zen or can get enlightened.
That's right. And that's part of the difficulty with, that Philip Kapleau had with his teacher, and it goes on and on and on. And it's a very, very difficult transition to make, and the only solace we can take is that the same thing happened trying to get it into Tibet, the same thing happened getting it into China, the same thing into Korea, and it's really a process of 2 and 3 generations, you know. And my hat's off to all the people, certainly like yourself, and all the our friends who are teaching. It's a really heroic act, and it's very, very difficult. And, my politically incorrect joke about this is one of the definitions of pioneer is the guy with all the arrows in his back.
Yeah, that's right.
And I know a lot of people with arrows in their back.
Yeah, well, I see ourselves as part of the bridge generations, and, bridges have to be walked over, and so we get a little stepped on sometimes. But it's also an honor. We get to uphold this tradition and path as it's crossing over from east to west and, just becoming more of a whole.
Yeah.
And so in the 90s, as people were asking me to come and teach, I started to bring those people to Nepal and to India and to France to meet my teachers. And we led some 2-month retreats with a lot of Vipassana teachers and people like Ram Dass and Dan Goleman attending in the early 90s. So eventually, it wasn't just I started teaching Dzogchen. I brought my teachers and translated for them, and I was teaching too.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes they canceled and didn't come, and I had to teach it myself and things like that. And then, of course, those teachers started to die. So
don't you think you really stepped into this when your own teacher died? And one of the things that he left you with on his deathbed was the desire that you would produce 100 of you?
Yeah, well, he said 100 lineage heirs like yourself.
Right.
Also, I was interpreting for him for countless interviews. This is one of the best teachers' trainings I've had.
Yeah. So looking back, we've now had 30 years of this sort of wonderful experiment where 30 years ago there was literally none of these alternative approaches, whether it's shamanic or psychedelics or meditation or any of these sorts of spiritual realizations. Certainly the Western tradition has a fair number of those, but they're not very common in this country and certainly not very easy to find. So we had 30 years of that, which has been exquisite in terms of both the things we learned that worked and the many things we learned that didn't work or didn't work very well. And so now it's I tend to see the next decade or so as a consolidation period where people can kind of sit back, they can reflect, see the way authentic spirituality is growing, whether it's happening in Judaism and Kabbalah. It's a lot of Christian, Orthodox, conventional Christian approaches are getting deeply interested in their own mystical roots and their own mystical traditions, which are very rich. And all of, Father Thomas Keating, for example, Rabbi Zalman and so on, these are really extraordinary men and women that are drawing on their own deep traditions to bring a more authentic living presence and ground and realization. And so I think on the one hand, the last 30 years are certainly exciting, and Lord knows we could make a movie out of your adventures. I mean, it's, quite incredible.
Dharma and Greg already did a half-hour sitcom about my life. It was called The Return of Leonard. I was on Dharma and Greg once. Guy at Chuck Knoll came to one of my day-longs, and he liked me, so he wrote an installment of Dharma and Greg based on my life. It's great.
The Return of Leonard, Surya Das version.
Yeah. Leonard. Leonard comes back from Nepal, and he's sort of celibate, but he touches people, and they feel better, and he also likes sports. He goes to the Laker games.
I'm going to have to run down a copy of that now.
It kind of reaches all levels of our culture. That's why this is a time of consolidation and, integration also.
Yeah.
Like what you were talking about, the Christians and Jews looking more deeply for meditation and mysticism in their own tradition. Some of this is a result of the cross-fertilization, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
The interaction with the East. So just like the Eastern traditions are becoming less quietistic and a little more socially engaged or democratic.
I agree entirely. I was brought up Southern Baptist, which might be the least spiritual religion on the face of the planet.
I didn't know that about you.
Yes. When I first got into college and started exploring these things, found Alan Watts and Krishnamurti and Ramana Maharshi and so on, I was just stunned. I had absolutely no idea that spirituality had anything to do with that. I thought spirituality was about not drinking, not smoking, and not fucking. And burning in hell forever.
That's what we were introduced to. It was social and it was very exoteric.
Very mythic membership, blue mean, conformist, conventional, whatever term you want to use. And so when I really started exploring Eastern traditions, I then could come back and look at the Western traditions and go, well, good heavens, they're just all over the place, but you have to look for them. So it was a real revelation for me to be able to come back and, in a sense, befriend my own Judeo-Christian roots by understanding some of the deeper currents present in those traditions.
Well, I found that growing up I couldn't get much stimulation or depth in my own Hebrew school experience or from talking to my friends or their priests, but when I came back from India and started to look at it through the eye of Dharma a little more, certainly could see so much of that wisdom in Jesus' Gospels or the saints and mystics, not to mention the Kabbalah and the Zohar, things I had never heard about while growing up in suburban Judaism.
Yeah.
But how old were you when you first started reading those books, then?
It was 1967 was the summer of love, right, in San Francisco. I graduated from high school in 67, which must, I think, very similar to when you did, didn't you?
I graduated in 68.
68. So I went to Duke University in the medical program and started reading Taoism and Watts and Krishnamurti during that year, and it blew everything open. And that was 68, really. And I was doing protests at Duke University, and we were doing sit-ins. We were very, very, I think, very sincere, but a little naive, let's say, and a little taken with ourselves, I suspect. But Pete Seeger came by, and Bobby Kennedy and Joan Baez sang to us, and the National Guard gassed the campus in 1968. It was all sort of standard boomer education in those days. And as I really got into the practice of it and found the Three Pillars of Zen and then went down and met Philip Kapleau and started a very intense practice, then it was a very, very quick acceleration, but it had no relation to the entire first half of my life. Mm-hmm. It's an entirely different universe, And now it's so great because I see kids that are 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds show up here to work at Integral Institute. They've read all of my stuff. They've practicing meditation for years. They've gone to 2 or 3 retreats, and I look at them and I go, holy mackerel, come over here, let me strangle you, you little shit. So it's really exquisite, actually.
Well, you were like a Tilku. You got it right away. You were very young. I'm amazed when I look at those first books of yours. You wrote them when you were like 22 or 23, right?
I did. You have to sort of believe in reincarnation in a certain sense. Your example as well, most of the people I know that really got into this, there was a recognition sometime in their teens, something was calling them, that they had a very, very profound realization that this path was theirs, so to speak. And I think, it's it makes a certain amount of sense, doesn't it? We came a little bit primed for this thing.
Right.
So I
think there are a few things that we need to look into today that are not popular but still have to be kept in the recipe, like rigorousness and investigation and questioning and self-discipline. And I know some of these words don't have the great associations, but I think they're very appropriate. Sacrifice and renunciation. Like, I really couldn't get what I was after without giving up a lot.
Yeah.
And just dabbling or trying to meditate while I was at college or even just traveling around in India. You know, I got a lot, but I had to focus more. So for me, that meant not, you know, besides daily practice, like long retreats, monasticism, language study, like rigor, you know, devoting myself to one teacher for quite a while.
Right.
I mean, I'm all for doing it with everybody, and I've done it with everybody too, but I also have one or two teachers that I really devoted myself to and that knew me and, you know, got on my case when they needed to. It wasn't abstract like today. So many people say the Dalai Lama is my teacher.
Or Ramana Maharshi.
Right.
Everybody.
They need an Upa guru, like somebody to push our buttons, or
I agree.
A local mentor or spiritual benefactor.
Well, that's one of the things we want to talk about next time, perhaps, is kind of the overall state of affairs, if you will, of Buddhism in particular, but spirituality in general. We want to talk about some of the missteps, which I think in many cases can be summarized as sort of the boomeritis approach, and also the positive things. And everything that you mentioned in my book is a positive, even though, as you say, they're not exactly snappy catchwords for today's atmosphere. So that's one of the things I think be very important to review, because this is a period of consolidation. We are looking back and saying, you know, believe it or not, I've gained a certain wisdom over 3 decades of trying to do this. And the dust has settled a little bit. We've had a chance to see what parts of us were driven by deep wisdom, what parts by neurosis, what parts by confusion, and hopefully make some sort of mid-course correction in a sense, or overall review of what we've done and ways to best carry it forward for ourselves and the next generation.
Yeah, it's about balance.
I think it is about balance.
And also, you know, I feel like, just to speak personally, that I spent 40 or 50 years looking for what I was looking for, and now, to some extent, I found it, and now it's time for me to pass that on before I die.
I think that's exactly right.
And we need to mentor others and not just become old fools. Somebody needs to be the elders for the next generation.
Yeah.
And we need a little real integrity or determination to do that, you know, some kind of real direction to focus, to not be perfectionistic and keep perfecting ourselves in this imperfect world, but also pass it on, you know, not wait until we're all perfect before we can try to help anybody else. That would just paralyze us.
Well, I frequently say a lot of people have hesitancy about becoming teachers, and I understand that. But the standard response there is second graders can teach first graders.
That's right. And, you know, those of us who are concerned about that may be the most likely to be good teachers rather than people who are rushing into it. Or look at the rabbis, priests, and teachers and professors we have today. 4 or 5 years of graduate school, they may be 30, and then they're passing it on.
Frightening thought.
So, you know, if we're concerned that we're not good enough, maybe that's partly a good qualification to be a responsible, humble elder.
Yeah, I think
rather than a know-it-all expert that thinks, you know, we're better than everybody else. So if we know our limitations, we can really work to produce, you know, people who far outstrip us.
One hopes.
Yeah, one would hope.
Yeah, it's an old saying, too, is that if you don't have at least one student that surpasses you, you're a lousy teacher.
That's a great slogan. Is that a spiritual slogan, or is that out of teacher's college?
I've just heard it for a while. I think it's I think it actually was a philosopher. It might have been somebody from, you know, some German whose name began with an H. Uh-huh. Most of their philosophers' names begin with an H, so I don't know what that story is. Oh, God. Well, this is great. Next time we talk, we'll do kind of a focus on the state of affairs today, you know, boomeritis Buddhism, what we can do about that, the difference between selecting a language to skillful means address an audience versus getting caught up in the philosophy of that language. We can use an egalitarian language as long as we're aware of what we're doing, because too many people with sort of narcissism will confuse a great perfection, everything is already self-liberated statement with the notion that their ego, just as it is perfect. Exactly. He's a guru, and which is a nightmare, as you know. And so we can kind of redress, talk about that, see how we can move that forward in a way that unites those two paradoxical aspects that you were talking about, which is, yes, right now everything literally is the great perfection. It's self-liberating in its own condition as it arises. And you have to practice about 10 years before you can say that with any authenticity. And until we start to get both sides of those, it can really be unfortunate. So that's one of the things that we can get into a little bit more of the substance.
Okay, good.
Okay, pal.
Okay.
Much love to you.
Love.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Ken.
How you doing, buddy?
Good. How are you?
Good, pal.
How's your health treating you?
Well, I'm hanging in there. How's your health?
I'm fine.
Yeah?
Going through all kinds of tests and little things, but nothing serious.
So, we can just talk about a few things. We have kind of talked a little bit more about some of the, more serious concerns. We've talked about this, you and I, before, everything from Buddha, Dharma, and its reception in the West, the difficulties of bringing a new tradition into a new culture, particularly the first-generation pioneers, such as yourself, that get transmission from...
We can talk about pioneers and upaya.
Pioneers in upaya, exactly. And all of the pits and perils of, therein. And one of the things, as you know, a lot of the Tibetans, Japanese, a lot of the cultures that we're importing religions from are also deeply suspicious of the West and its capacity to understand Dharma.
It's worse than that, like Japanese Zen masters saying you can't meditate in pants or in a chair or, but... Who really cares today about that?
Well, but talk about that a bit, because you had the same experience with the Tibetans.
I lived in Japan for a year. People would say white people can't be real Buddhists. I say, okay, whatever you say. You must be an expert. You're Japanese. You must be an expert on Buddhism.
I wonder if anybody pointed out to both the Tibetans and the Japanese that Buddha was neither Tibetan nor Japanese.
Yeah, well, How many conversations do you have with Tibetans and Japanese? I mean, mine are very rare these days.
Well, understood.
You know what I mean?
But as you well know, that's really where the transition occurred, wasn't it?
Yeah, right.
And, you spent as much time studying with the Tibetans as any Lama in this country, interspersed with your time studying with Japanese Zen masters.
Yeah. Well... I'm willing to speak out about those things. Some of my teachers, even spoke boldly about this, like Suzuki Roshi did, that the tradition was too ossified and calcified and, familyified and just sort of codified and deadened in their old country. And he was looking, he liked staying in California for that. I think that's real interesting.
So on the one hand, you have the whole problem. We're sort of jumping from, jumping from the one shore to the other shore. You have the whole reluctance of the traditions to let go of these things. And then once you land on this shore, in this case America, you met with a whole nother slew of problems.
Right.
And it seems that the sort of first half of the last 30 years was making the jump from the other shore towards this one, and all of the problems of actually getting off the ground, getting airborne from those cultures. And that means going through the Tibetan teachers, Indian teachers, Japanese, Korean, and so on. And now it's like the last decade or so, most of the perils are now how to get any Buddha Dharma or any spiritual orientation into modern culture without modern culture wrecking it, basically.
Well, that's a real challenge, and I think it's an interesting living discussion, about not throwing Buddha out with the bathwater, or, the pitfalls and perils, the opportunities and obstacles.
Yeah. So, in your own view, what are some of the main difficulties in getting Dharma into a culture such as ours?
Well, one is the speed, fast-paced modern society.
Right.
So, on one hand, the time seems short. Everybody wants it now. Things are moving so fast. Everybody's so, quote, free and mobile. It's hard to dig deep, grow roots, get to the nutrients, keep digging until you find the water.
So 10 years of practice is not something that most Americans find appealing.
No, that's right. No, we live in a pill culture.
Yep. Microwave.
And, instant gratification. I call it instant coffee mind. Just add hot water and you have it. It might not taste good, but it's called coffee. Now food. Add hot water and you have food.
As one comedian said, I put instant coffee in the microwave and went backwards in time. And that's sort of how we want to do our spirituality, I think. It's just that fast. So do you find that you've had to compromise to some degree your teachings because of that, or is it more just upaya fitting it to?
Compromise is fine to talk about, but one could just as well put in a more positive spin and say, it's all upaya, and, does it really take 30 years of monastic training or 10 years of ritual and 10 years of philosophy before you can meditate?
Right.
Or do you need a 3-year retreat to go through those practices? Do you have to learn the foreign language? How much time do you save by doing it in English?
Yep.
When you have tape recorders, you don't have to memorize everything. You can restudy it without memorization.
Yep.
So I wouldn't call those shortcuts or compromises. I'd call those advances. So the speed also makes it more quickly accessible. But, the downside of it, again, is sort of the modern phenomena. I don't want to just call it the American phenomenon. It's kind of the modern dilemma of, everything new is good, but then what's new?
Yeah.
What's next?
Yeah.
What's new?
So on the one hand, you have the fact that some of the difficulties are actually opportunities to adjust, adapt, and evolve spirituality to the present.
Yeah, I think there are opportunities,
Sure.
and with the light comes the dark, and with the dark, the shadows are also nothing but light. So there's both, like commercialism and fads and, whatever you want to call it, like the hotness of Buddhism in Hollywood or in publishing.
Yeah.
The downside is the fads pass, but the upside is that the opportunity is here.
Yeah. Agreed. At the same time, it's not all sort of sweetness and light, is it?
No.
I mean, there are various approaches to Buddhism that I think both you and I would agree are a little bit problematic.
Yes.
And so let's just, theren through a few of those.
There's also the difficulties of the dilution of it,
Exactly.
Just because you hear about it or read about it or visit the website or, read a bestseller about it, the kind of bookstore Buddhism doesn't mean, now I understand Buddhism, what's next?
Yep, exactly.
After some years maybe you can start to say that, but, or decades, but not after one encounter or one so-called enlightenment weekend, that kind of thing.
So the dilution is part of the downside of the speed factor. In other words, if that's not done carefully, then you don't just sort of condense and make the teachings more appropriate. You can actually dilute them by catering to the demand for quickness.
Yep, there's both sides. Also the demand for simplifying things could be good, but oversimplifying them, then you fall into, simplistic thinking.
Right.
So, years of learning, reflection, and meditation, as the Tibetans would say, are necessary. Those three, not just meditation and not just learning.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to, tease all this out. There's, I think of it when I analyze my own work or when my board members and colleagues, we analyze our work. There's the broad horizontal dimension of outreach and breadth.
Yep.
And, popularity. And then there's the deep dimension of depths, which might narrow and might only, include 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 Dharma heirs.
Right.
And then there are all the quadrants in between.
Right. So part of the difficulty, again, is, and we've talked about this as well, it's one thing to speak in a way that you can meet people where you find them, and it's to be skillful means in adapting their language, their philosophy, in order to more effectively communicate in a way that they can hear and understand. And then the downside of that, which I think both of us think some teachers have fallen into, is you so adopt, when in Rome, do as the Romans, that you so adopt a Roman language that actually dilutes the Dharma right out of existence in really, really horrifying ways, actually.
Well, I would say, when in samsara, if you do the samsaric way, then it's not Dharma, it just becomes something more delusional. It's like feeding a habit. So I think, there has to be some spine or backbone or focus or essence, like somebody like Chogyam Trungpa. I think that's an example for all of us of skillful means.
Yeah. One of the things that I think even the traditional people have to kind of be reminded of is that spirit itself, or spiritual realities, or suchness or isness, isn't contained in a particular school of religion or an approach. Those are techniques of finding it, or tools for finding spirit. Spirit is the reality of this moment, here and now.
Right.
And so teachings have to continue to adapt themselves to the reality of here and now if they're going to reveal spiritual realities here and now.
Yes.
And so I think that we tend to confuse the tool with the reality.
That comes back to skillful means.
Right. So, my own, of course, some of my criticism is summarized in the phrase boomeritis Buddhism.
Right. Well, that's a good way of analyzing it.
Now, I'll take about 2 minutes and give a brief overview of a little more theoretical approach to boomeritis Buddhism and some of the things that can go wrong, and then we can sort of talk about this for a second. Mm-hmm. As you know, in the great meditative traditions, they're very, very good, and they have exquisite means of revealing several really profound aspects of mind and reality. And one of them is they have mapped out in exquisite detail states of consciousness, meditative states, higher states of awareness, states of gross, subtle, and causal dimensions and qualities, and very, very profound in that way. They've also mapped out certain types of what could be called phenomenal stages. In other words, if you introspect your mind over a long period of time, you might see some things unfold in a general wave-like or stage-like fashion. The great traditions are full of those types of stages of Mahamudra, and not in any rigid, linear kind of way, but they're just sort of guideposts for things that tend to emerge if you stay on the path. St. Teresa's 7 interior castles is a classic example of phenomenal stages of meditative unfolding. Now, what the modern West has brought to the picture is an understanding of what could be called intersubjective stages, or how actual context, cultural backgrounds, interpersonal interactions can go through stages as well. And these don't show up in meditation. And these types of stages are well known in the work of Carol Gilligan, Lawrence Kohlberg, Robert Keegan, Jane Lovinger, Claire Graves studied the developmental line of values, and the Claire Graves work has been popularized in spiral dynamics. And what they find, of course, is that value structures themselves tend to grow and develop and evolve. And in just using spiral dynamics and Claire Graves, they found about 8 major waves or stages of unfolding consciousness when it comes to values and worldviews. And some of the relevant ones are sort of in increasing order of inclusiveness. Red, which is very egocentric, me-only, power drives, and so on, very sort of third chakra. Blue, which is traditional, conformist, nothing but tradition, no innovation. It can be very rigid, very, very anti-progress. It's classically associated with fundamentalistic approaches to religion, whether in the East or in the West. And then orange, which is sort of modern, scientific, rational, associated with the Western Enlightenment. The next one is green, which is postmodern, and this tends to be pluralistic, multicultural, sensitivity, all of the things that we've come to associate with postmodernism and the cultural creatives of our generation. And then the 2 higher stages, and there are ones, I think, beyond these, but the 2 that they acknowledge are called yellow and turquoise. And those are basically what are called integral or integrative or comprehensive, because starting at those stages of development, individuals start to integrate, pull together, and appreciate all of the previous stages and all of the contributions that they've made. And so you develop these sort of increasing spheres of inclusiveness and greater consciousness and greater embrace in terms of the growth of consciousness, care, and compassion. Now, to sort of bring that part to an end, part of the difficulty is that when you get to Buddhism and its translation into this country, if you look at the great Buddhist texts, if you look at the Avatamsaka Sutra, if you look at most of the Tantras, if you look at the Lankavatara Sutra, these are turquoise or higher productions. They are exquisitely high productions. Right. And my concern is that they're getting translated downward by many teachers into mere green. Right. Because there's a certain superficial similarity of language with Dzogchen Great Perfection, for example.
Right. Well, a lot of talk about oneness or interconnectedness.
Exactly.
Totality, but they're really thinking about, it's really kind of the below the medium common denominator, kind of mediocrity, rather than, evolving, interwoven different dimensions.
Right. Right.
Yeah. kind of the spiral, multidimensional, integration.
Yeah. In a sense, it's fine if you're a turquoise teacher and you want to adapt your teaching for somebody who's red or somebody who's blue or somebody who's orange and so on. And certainly in the old countries, in Tibet, India, Japan, and so on, much of the background culture is blue. And so for the popular Buddhism in those countries are no more than, Buddha loves me, this I know, for the sutra tells me so.
No, to get to green would be good.
Well, green is a step up in that regard. Right. But my problem
it's not yellow or turquoise.
is that they're both important. And my concern is not if a turquoise or higher teacher adopts green language as a skillful means with the understanding that that's a way to reach approximately 25% of the population known as cultural creatives. My concern is when those same teachers identify Buddha Dharma with that green value structure, which is a very limited structure. That's a catastrophe in a sense, because that's a direct identification of Buddha Dharma with merely a relative set of values like that.
The ones in this country don't quickly come to mind. I mean, I do know somebody in Vermont who I consider the clearest American of all, and I will mention his name, but he's unknown because he's so clear he stays out of it, is Hari Namdas. He was Ram Dass's teacher somewhat in India.
Really?
He's an American. He's about 65 or 70.
Cool.
He's the most enlightened disciple of Nim Karoli Baba, as far as I can tell.
Yep.
And I go to him as a teacher, as a student.
That's fantastic.
And
I don't have any trouble with that.
Of course, the world doesn't know about him because he doesn't want me to tell anybody to come. And he has 5 people coming and sitting on his porch 3 nights a week. That's his satsang.
Right.
And he does inquiry or Zen or Dzogchen. He doesn't know what to call it. He says meditation is passé. He's really deep and non-dual.
Yeah. The popularized versions of these, which are green meme sort of dilutions down into mere postmodernist lingo, is becoming, in some cases, there are fairly well-known teachers and fairly well-respected scholars that are actually taking this seriously, and you will get academic treatises on how Derrida is really doing the same thing as Nagarjuna with shunyata and emptiness. It's just a mess.
That's nonsense in my view.
Yeah, and so that's part of what we're trying to do is bring some clarity into that situation and allow some of the higher teachings of Buddhism to not be translated downward in that sort of reflex fashion without a little bit more care.
It's a great challenge. I have a lot of devotion and connection with my own gurus, but it doesn't mean I don't have judgments about them also.
Yeah.
Because, it's not just one, it's not unidirectional, like maybe they were highly evolved on the Enlightenment spectrum, but not necessarily on the interrelational or, social, democratic, or I don't know what, ethical or emotional dimension.
What we call levels and lines.
Yeah. You've talked about this a lot, how high somebody could be in some way in realization, but not emotionally or, in other ways.
Right. Exactly right. This is very cool.
But I'd like to see more integral intercourse of various kinds.
Yes, exactly. After all that fragmented intercourse.
Yeah, right. Not to mention lonely, solitary forms.
Exactly. Oh, God.
So I feel, by the way, what is beyond the turquoise level, do you feel, in terms of, higher dimensions?
Our sense is that if you take people that have worked with developmental or evolutionary unfolding like Sri Aurobindo, or you can even check in with somebody like Plotinus, and certainly in the higher inner tantras, Anuttara Tantra Yoga, for example, there's a broad similarity of types of cognition that can occur, and these stages mean permanent acquisitions. So they're not merely temporary states or peak experiences or stuff like that. So if you look at Aurobindo, his turquoise is roughly what he would call higher mind. And then he had about 3 or 4 levels of cognitive development beyond turquoise. And those included the illumined mind, then the intuitive mind, then the overmind, and then the descent of supermind. And so that's one way of looking at it. Again, those stages are only a part of what's going on. And there has to be meditative states accomplished. There has to be some other minimum development in other lines, like moral development, which is why the traditions emphasize sila, jhana, prajna, a moral foundation, and then meditation, and then awareness. And all of those are things that we can start to track in a sense. When we put all of these different wonderful, great maps on the table of human growth and development and start to compare, contrast, see what similarities they share, see where the interesting differences are. And again, not as a way to pigeonhole people, but just as a way to get a sense about what's actually happening. And so the theory right now, the best guess right now, is that if you take stage conceptions like Jane Lovinger's stages of self-development, Carol Gilligan's stages of female moral development, Bob Keegan's stages of consciousness development, that what happens is if you take meditators, people who are meditating, and you give them the tests of stage development, what you find is that nothing can make people skip stages, but meditation dramatically accelerates their movement through the stages. And so you can take somebody, for example, the population at large, about 2% of the population at large are the equivalent of yellow and turquoise. But after 4 years of meditation, the percentage of the people doing that moves from 2% to 38%. At those higher levels. Now that's astonishing because psychoanalysis can't do that, psychotherapy can't do that, role-playing can't do that. Meditation is the only tool that's been empirically demonstrated to move people through stages like that. Now that's very profound. I mean, that's a very wonderful piece of information.
Well, I believe that.
And that's a very substantial body of empirical data showing that meditation can help people move through these stages according to the tests that we've given so far. And I think probably the reason that that happens is whatever else you're doing in meditation, you are witnessing, being aware, giving attention to the contents of the mind as they arise. And because you're doing that, you're tending, in a good sense, to disidentify, let go, not be attached to them. And that allows you to disidentify with whatever stage you're at and move more easily and quickly to the next higher stage as it emerges. And that's certainly consonant with the data that we see. It makes sense in terms of the data that we see. And one of the reasons that we're trying to have a little bit of an integral approach is that those stage conceptions, as I say, aren't found in the great meditative traditions. You can sit on a Zen mat for 15 years, and you'll never see anything that says, this is an orange thought, this is a green thought, this is a yellow thought, and so on.
Right.
The reason is that these types of stages are, you can only get at them with an approach, which is you actually take large populations of people. You don't look at an individual meditator and what they're doing.
Right.
You take, groups of hundreds of them, and you pose certain dilemmas or certain questions. So classically, Kohlberg, for example, would ask people, a poor man is married to a woman who has a terminal illness. He can't afford a medicine that would save her life. Does he have the right to steal it? And Kohlberg found that people gave 3 responses. The first response was, yes, he has a right to steal it. The second response was, no, he does not have a right to steal it. And the third response was, yes, he has a right to steal it. But the reasons given were very different. The first response, which was, yes, he has a right to steal it, you ask them why, and they say, because I can do anything I want. Reality is what I say it is, fuck you. The next response, which is no, then you say, well, why not? And they go, well, because that's against the law. If you break the law, that's horrible. You can't break the law. That would be terrible. And then the third response which is, yes, he can steal it. And you ask them why. And they say, because they're universal principles, life is more valuable than $22 for medicine. And so Kohlberg then, you track these people over time. And what you find, you keep giving them the test, months and years later, what you find is that if somebody who starts out giving response 2, if they change, they always change to response 3, never to response 1. In other words,
that's a hierarchy of development.
Exactly. These are stages, not just responses, but stages. So that's generally the kind of research that the contemplative traditions didn't do. So as far as I can tell, and I haven't seen a lot of people have looked, and we can't find those kinds of stages in the contemplative traditions. So by combining what Western psychology can tell us with these fantastic tools, techniques, and psychologies and psychospiritual systems of the great contemplative traditions, then we start to get a much more interesting, I think, kind of overview of human possibilities, which is very exciting, actually.
Well, what I'd be interested in seeing is how one can, using the word meditation sort of, generically as you did, how we can get, let's say, that 2% to get 38%, progress, or to go from 2% having that kind of progress to 38%.
Right.
Without it just being something like Buddhism, for example, but more emphasizing the principle, the active ingredient
of awareness, disidentification, detachment, and so on.
Yeah, how the active principle, summed up in the generic word meditation, can be applied so that many of the most astute people can, so 38% can get the benefit rather than just 2% at this point or in the next generation.
I agree.
And that way preserving the active ingredient of the tradition, whether or not Buddhism goes from 2% phenomena in this country to 38%. And that would be, in a way, isolating, sort of the vitamin C from the citrus fruits.
Or penicillin from the moldy bread.
Right, yeah.
I agree entirely. But you have an interest in seeing that happen, too, don't you? Sort of moving it. Yeah.
Right, that's something about the breath dimension.
Yeah, indeed. So are you optimistic about how this is going?
I'm optimistic. Although things have been weighing on me heavily since 9/11 here in the East Coast and the war in Iraq and all the spin and
talk about that.
Bush administration, and the corporate hypocrisy and everything we face. But I think, just looking in the longer term over the decades and the generations, that we have every reason to be optimistic. So, I feel good about it, and I think we have to, always keep hope alive, but also be very attentive that we're not just taking it for granted, that we're actually making a difference.
What was the main impact of 9/11 on your orientation?
Well, here on the East Coast, it was like a body blow. I live near Boston, and my sister had a meeting in the World Trade Center that day, which she never, got to go to. She could have been there. And my brother was in Washington and got stuck overnight in a building across the Pentagon, because when the plane hit there. And it was heavy. We all know people who died or people who know people who died. And it was a big wake-up call and a big shock. But also, part of the shock I'm feeling since then is how we closed down afterwards and everybody tries to go back to business as normal.
Yeah.
And how short a wake-up call can be and how strong our cultural and materialist kind of business-like conditioning is to want to go back to what we call normal and pretend that these things aren't happening regularly in other parts of the world. Part of the wake-up call and the shock was people couldn't believe that it could happen here, but it's been happening in other places for a long time.
Right.
And only a few thousand people died that day. It was terrible, but it's because it was our people that people were so upset. These things have been going on in other parts of the world a lot over recent times, in the Balkans and in Africa and so on, in Ireland, and terrorism and loss of civilian life and all kinds of things. So it's very, there's been a lot of stress. I think half the people in New York and Boston, Washington, are experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome since then. And a lot of that, of course, is not well treated or well understood by the general populace. So there's a lot of stress, and it's a cause for compassion. I've been feeling it's incumbent upon me to stay a little more informed. I'd say my most difficult practice in the last year or two has been paying a little more attention to the news and the newspapers so that I'm not an uninformed authority figure speaking from the pulpit, as I so often see happening. I really, don't want to perpetrate that kind of narrow-mindedness by being uninformed and speaking about these things, because people inevitably ask. On the other hand, I think I'm also more called to meditate and to pray and to do things for the long term.
Right.
Not obsess too much about Ralph Nader and, the Supreme Court in the last election or things like that. That some people, I was just in Oregon, people are still obsessing about that. And that's all well and good, but I think I like to think more about the present and the future and do something different.
Yeah.
Find another way.
So what's your recommendation to those people under those circumstances? Did you say something?
Well, I think we have to let go of who we think we are and who we used to be and find out what's real and who we really can be.
Yeah.
And, not just think about that. That was kind of like a World Series that, if we're democratic, kind of think as we lost. But there are other years. And even now, why is it that we have such limited alternatives to this Bush regime? Who's going to run in the next election? Is there a viable candidate? Why are the conservative Republicans and conservative right religiously carrying, sort of winning the field? Where is the liberal left? Where is the liberal religious speakers? I feel like we're missing something, and we need a little more analysis and reflection and conversation, perhaps, to learn a little more what I like to call higher education.
Yeah.
Not just college and graduate school,
yeah.
but about the interconnectedness and causes and origins of all life and our responsibility and part in this. So there's more voter turnout, there's more social and spiritual activism, and so forth.
Jim Garrison, as you know, the founder of the State of the World Forum, calls it neoconservative juggernaut. And he says he's just alarmed, speaking for himself, his personal opinion is that he's alarmed at just how unstoppable in this country the thing seems to be and how disturbed the rest of the world is at, in a sense, what America is doing. And whether you agree with it or not, America seems to, 9/11, and one argument is that America almost kind of regressed in a certain sense. It went from a kind of an orange to green orientation, certainly with people like Bill Clinton and Al Gore, right down to blue fundamentalist, ethnocentric, conservative, represented by the president by his own admission. And around the world, that's very alarming, certainly to European countries and so on. And
well, I think we squandered a lot, all the goodwill that we had after 9/11, and also we kind of recoiled sort of from, as you were saying, a more green administration and outlook. It's kind of like under attack, we recoiled into our sort of amphibian brain or reptilian brain, sort of fight or flight response.
Exactly.
That fits well with, the cowboy from Texas approach to us or them and wanted dead or alive, presumably, preferably dead. So this does relate to what we were talking about before, I think, Ken, about spiral evolution and going wider, deeper, broader, not just higher, but evolving. And it's not necessarily linear, but we regress at our own cost.
Yeah.
And there is a cost, and I think in terms of American civilization, we may be heading over the hill if we're not careful.
It's a perilous time.
So I'm pessimistic about this upcoming election, but looking forward to the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, and I also think that some of us have to think about how we can have our say or make a difference, or like Roger likes to say, Bucky used to say, be trim tabs.
Be trim tabs. Mike Murphy calls it social acupuncture.
Yeah, and we have to find those points where making a fine point makes a huge difference because it's connected to many other, parts of the whole.
Yeah.
And I do think that spirituality offers an opportunity to that. And again, I'm talking about Dharma rather than just any particular ism, Buddhism otherwise.
Sure.
It's it's an evergreen subject because some people even say America is the most religious country in the world. I find those words kind of ludicrous, but I know what they mean.
Yeah.
So, real spirituality, whatever that means, which we have to, make ring true.
Yeah.
Authentic spirituality, true liberating and freeing Dharma, noble Dharma, not isms and schisms, can continue to play a role, and even a more important role if there's some of us who are up to that. I think that comes back to us.
Right.
Some of us have to be up to it. It doesn't matter what the names are, but there has to be, a certain amount.
So should Bodhisattvas be politicians?
If that's their kind of path, why not? Like Dag Hammarskjöld, he certainly, and U Thant, they certainly were.
Yep.
Or Gandhi.
Yep. But
it's tricky. It's tricky to play with the levers of power, or get in the swamp. You get soaked with the swamp juice. I don't know that I've ever said this before. I go to a lot of meetings and conferences. I never hear spiritual people talk about power. Everybody's afraid to think about it.
Yeah.
And maybe me too. But there it is. So some other people who maybe are less conscientious are not afraid to talk and think about it, and sort of like business people who will do whatever needs to be done.
Well, there's an old quote from Edmund Burke that I think is really important and applies directly to power. And he said, in order for evil to triumph, all that's necessary is that good men and women do nothing.
Yeah, right.
And it's very, very similar with power. If we're afraid of it, if we don't want to talk about it, fine. We do nothing, and it will triumph.
I think it would be good for us to study power and where true power comes from, and the difference between like spiritual power and the power of purity on one hand, and mere force and power over other people on the other hand, and sort of everything in between, and really see what is significant about how to be a positive influence in the world, how to be, powerful, and how to embody it, and how to be the changes we need to see, as Gandhi says, and everybody's quoting, and how to find the power within ourselves and within each other and our connections to make that happen. Not just feel like we're helpless or we're waiting for a leader to pull us along. We have to be those leaders. I think that's a message we have to think about today.
Well said, my friend.